Welcome, everyone. I am here with Matt. We are discussing Michael Cimino, one of the very famous and debatably infamous directors in Hollywood for his contributions and, well, I guess leave it at contributions to the new Hollywood era. Uh, First and foremost, Matt, how are you doing today? And any thoughts, any overarching thoughts about this topic today?
Um, I'm doing well, and I think this is, we were just saying this before we started the podcast, but this is kind of a perfect director and two set of movies to talk about that in terms of it fitting into what we've been talking about, auteurs and directors as authors and producer interference in, I guess, the 70s American film industry.
Absolutely, and we've uh, been devouring '70s material so much so that I went on like a '70s kick watching like The Sting, uh, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, a lot of other '70s movies just from the stuff that we were watching because and I think you can speak to this too, Matt, but the '70s have a very distinct feel to them, and it is titled so. But I mean, can you kind of speak to that, and I guess what you enjoy a lot about that '70s style?
Yeah, the 70s are my favorite, and they've always been for a while, my favorite decade of movies, especially American movies. Mostly because I feel like we're getting in the 70s a bunch of films that are unique stories. It's kind of like, to use a video game or a movie analogy, how they like to remake old IPs or get licenses for old stories or popular ideas and then make a movie around it or remake a movie that was made, 100 years ago. And I feel like this 70s decade is when we get the most like new releases of films that are new ideas and their directors telling their personal stories oftentimes through uh a great story that can be relatable to audiences. And so it's kind of like you get a great cinematic experience that you would go into the theater and watch popcorn and enjoy, and it's entertaining. And at the same time you can dissect the movie and go a little deeper and discover a lot about who the director is as a person, and some deeper themes that they're trying to say about life or America or whatever it is.
Absolutely. The I mean, there was certainly a large influx of directors, and I think we kind of went into this, but it is very applicable and important to state for this episode that a lot of the reason for that was um, that production companies were financially struggling enough to where the formula went from let's pour a ton of money into these huge bombastic projects and instead we can invest in these new upstart directors where the director fee or their salary might not be nearly as much, and it gave a lot of new faces and names a chance, and out of that spurred the names of Steven Spielberg. We have Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, and Michael Cimino is definitely a name that stands out amongst those. He has flashes of greatness, and obviously, one of the movies we're going to be covering, The Deer Hunter, I believe won Best Picture and four other Academy Awards. But then the very controversial and important movie Heaven's Gate, which a lot of people maybe falsely point the finger at for ending the American New Wave hash or slash the New Hollywood era.
Yeah, I think we have an interesting conversation coming up about these.
What I want to ask you, Matt, is had you seen any Cimino films prior to these two?
Yeah, I saw Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, and I believe that was his directorial debut. That's the only movie I had seen from him, and I really enjoyed that one. I'd probably, uh, I'd say I enjoyed it, slightly more than Deer Hunter and more than Heaven's Gate. I think that was my favorite from him.
Yeah, I'm in the same exact boat as you. I watched Thunderbolt and Lightfoot probably close to a year ago. Great cast, and Jeff Bridges plays both in that movie and is kind of the standout in that movie. Um, while being cast beside Clint Eastwood, which is really, really impressive. He also is, one of the more major characters in Heaven's Gate. And Matt, you sent over to me a documentary going over Heaven's Gate and, all of the controversy about the budget and money lost and all the negative reviews. And they have interviews by Brad Dourif and Jeff Bridges. And in that documentary, it seems as though Jeff Bridges is, I think, very sympathetic and maybe even more so, actually seems to really like Michael Cimino, which was, I guess, I understand, but because of everything, all the murmurs you hear about Heaven's Gate, I coming into the documentary kind of expected there to be a lot of negative sentiment from everyone who was talking about him, that he'd be a bad guy, but Bridges definitely speaks to the contrary.
Yeah, he seemed, like he'd say some ridiculous thing that happened on set, and then he'd kind of say how he kind of enjoyed it. And I think one of the most interesting things about what he was saying in the documentary was at the end when, I mean, this was, I think, back in like 2005 or something, but he said he still lives on the set of Heaven's Gate because, he said Michael Cimino was offering it up at the end. He said if no one wants to live here, it's just going to get destroyed. And I think Jeff Bridges said he wanted it.
Yeah, so like there, I guess there was a log cabin whose I'm not sure which character lived in it, but they show it multiple times, and instead of using the logs for firewood, I guess they had the logs numbered and shipped or not shipped, like freighted over to Montana possibly or wherever Jeff Bridges lives. So he has that exact log cabin on his property now, which is that's a pretty interesting story. And I would assume if you despised working on that project, you probably wouldn't want such a big, constant reminder on your property.
Yeah, no, he clearly enjoyed Heaven's Gate. I think it's meaningful to him. And the way they described it, it seemed like quite an adventure being able or working as an actor on that set.
Exactly. And as we kind of get more into Heaven's Gate, I can't wait to talk about Camp Cimino and all of the things that went into every single scene from as like a more high up perspective though. As we were talking about the directors of this new Hollywood era, you kind of mentioned that a lot of them had distinct voices, and I think that is couldn't be more true than anyone for Michael Cimino. And these two movies both very long. That seems he's a bit long-winded and likes very long takes that kind of let you completely marinate in the scenes. But even Thunderbolt and Lightfoot, they all seem a little bit off the beaten path and not just rinse and repeat from what's generally done within the genres that his movies fall into.
Yeah, it feels like a weird mix of like what people would call slow cinema, where you know you just mentioned how it's kind of a defining trait, how long takes and kind of letting you, I guess, take in the setting and the scene, and it you know it just it depends how drawn in you get, depends on how, or if there's interesting things going on, or if what you're looking at is captivating. And I think in both movies, you know, there are several instances of, you know, you're either kind of into it or not. And, you know, if you're not into it, it's just gonna, the long take and slow pacing is just gonna annoy you. But if it kind of, if it can capture something important to you and you pay attention, then I think it's rewarding.
And this is another, and maybe bringing this up front isn't the right time to bring it up, but I can't help but let my mind wander. What would have become of Michael Cimino, the director, in his filmography, had Heaven's Gate come off the way he wanted it to? And he seems like Tarantino esque in that he kind of did three different genres, masculine driven. I kind of wonder like what would be the next genre, what would be the next big mountain for him to climb, and how extravagant would they have been. And I don't know if that same thought kind of crossed your mind after watching these two movies, but he definitely would have spoken in a different tone and a different voice, and I feel like he likes to experiment within different genres as well.
Yeah. You know, I think he was really going for, you know, like a Gone with the Wind or a Lawrence of Arabia, you know, a big epic feel to Heaven's Gate. And I think, you know, he might have jumped the gun a little, but in my mind, since he's very much you know, as you mentioned, a masculine kind of themes like violent type movies, like, you know, he did a war film and then Western. In my mind, he would have probably gone to a crime movie next and
Mm.
made something like you know, like Heat, like a really long kind of gangster epic type of movie would be my prediction.
And I don't know for certain. I think I believe his project following Heaven's Gate, I think there's a fairly big gap, like maybe 5 years, maybe even a little bit more. But I think Year of the Dragon was his next project, which has gotten like okay reviews, I think, from what I've seen. Nothing nearly as high as Thunderbolt and Lightfoot and The Deer Hunter, for sure. But I believe that is a crime movie, so I think you're dead on the money. But I think as far as what he would have been able to do with it, maybe the cast he would have been able to attract, and obviously the money he would have been able to pour into it would have been completely different had Heaven's Gate not had the reception that it did. So it's always interesting to wonder about stuff like that. This is something that I don't know myself, but I want to ask you, Matt, and hopefully not put you on the spot too much. But if you had to guess at who you think inspired Chimino, because he is so unique, but as like a lot of these new Hollywood people, they have a number of inspirations. Who would you presume to have been greatly inspirational to him?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Because when I think of like movies similar to him, um, they're kind of around the same era.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're in the 70s. So, because like we just did Sam, oh, I'm gonna butcher Peckinpah.
Yep.
His movies seem similar. Clint Eastwood type films seem similar as well. And maybe that's just because they have a Western flair to them. And, even The Deer Hunter, it didn't feel like it wasn't a Western flair so much as it just felt kind of small town Americana. So I don't know. Maybe also someone like we haven't discussed him, but this Italian director Vinscotti, he kind of made like a few or one movie is specifically called The Leopard. It's a long 3 hour like drama type of film that kind of merges with battles and war a little bit. So that's kind of I feel like an epic with violence in it is what I would think would be his biggest influences or inspirations.
Yeah, I have not seen Vinscotti, so I can't personally speak to that. But as far as like the drawn out nature, that definitely rings a bell with Cimino. But with what you said from him reminding me of people during his own time period, I'd have to completely agree with that. Um, the Deer Hunter, it feels kind of like Taxi Driver. I don't know if you got that at all. And then Heaven's Gate, there's some similarities, and I might be in the same boat as you, where just because of the Western flair, but I get a little bit of Once Upon a Time in the West, which is Sergio Leone. Um, I don't know. Did you kind of feel that Taxi Driver, like that edge that Taxi Driver has within the Deer Hunter?
Yeah, I did. I was thinking, kind of what I said about how it's similar to other movies in its time period. I kind of like felt that a lot. That this was like very similar to. I mean, it doesn't feel like a Scorsese movie, but maybe it's just the presence of Robert De Niro.
True.
But it did. I don't know exactly how to explain why it felt like a movie like Taxi Driver or even the movie we uh, discussed I guess 2 weeks ago was now um and as well as like The Searchers or a Ford movie.
Mm.
That would be more similar to Heaven's Gate. I don't know. It's difficult. I can't really put into words why it's similar to Taxi Driver, but I just felt like maybe the way it's filmed and the themes are similar.
Yeah. Well, the way he covered Clareton, PA, which I have not visited there, but it is, we'll just say it's close to where I live. Um, that feels like the way he was able to capture that, which there's a ton of neighborhoods around there just like Clareton, PA. Feels like he was able to capture the authenticity just the way that Scorsese was able to capture New York City, which personally I'm gonna say I think is even more impressive because Scorsese grew up there. Cimino, to my knowledge, and I might be dead wrong, but I don't think he ever lived in Pennsylvania. But he was still kind of able to capture that small steel town feel, and the camaraderie of steel workers, and it gave the film some atmosphere, which is such a big part in both films as to how the protagonists feel separated from that throughout the process of the movie.
Yeah, for me, I feel like I'm not sure if he's from New York City, but I felt like he's in both these films. Even though one is set back in the early kind of, I guess you could say, Civil War days, a lot like other westerns are set. But they're both kind of capturing a sense of the what the American dream is. And Deer Hunter being in the Vietnam era, or being set to the current time period it was released in, which I feel like also probably struck a chord with all the audience at the time that was watching it and had experienced people they knew, coming home from the war and kind of losing their minds. And maybe the audience just didn't want a sort of Barry Lyndon type movie quite yet from Cimino. Maybe he should have, done another sort of relatable 70s type film before he went off and tried to create an epic world that you could sit and watch for more than 3 hours.
Mm-hmm. That's a tall task. Um, Even still, I can only imagine it's kind of always been that way, and I think we've even kind of talked at length about this, where the duration or runtime of a movie, even one that we think is going to be amazing, one that we're excited at the prospect to see, it is a challenge to actually carve that time out of your schedule and and just sit down and actually watch it. And that is, probably one of the barriers to entry for both of these movies, the Deer Hunter and Heaven's Gate.
Yeah, like sitting down and giving it your full attention. Uh, I didn't, we both didn't watch the full, like, near 4 hour version of Heaven's Gate. But, taking the time out and then also getting excited, to want to sit and watch the full thing is a tough thing to do. And also, the movie that is this long, it's, to me, that promotes the whole love slash hate dynamic even more, because if you don't like it, in a sense, you're stuck there for over 3 hours,
Mm-hmm.
and you're gonna dislike it even more, But if you're really into it and you can't get enough of it, then you're gonna love it lasting, 3+ hours.
Oh, absolutely. Um, I have two little anecdotes that will probably bore the hell out of, hopefully not everyone, but um, one, Seven Samurai, took me a while to watch, just because it's 3 hours. Hard to find that much time. Became one of my favorite movies of all time. Cut to childhood memory. Went with a friend to see Peter Jackson's King Kong. Was super excited, as I think most kids were at the prospect of seeing King Kong on the big screen. And we're probably like 2 hours in, and I think tears started to come into my eyes because I was like, this movie is so damn long. I just wanted to get out of that theater. Um, and I think that's considered a really good interpretation. I believe I could be wrong on that, but it's painful to sit in the theater, especially for kids. But even adults, just they don't want to sit that long for a lot of films. So I mean, if you're gonna take that big swing at the 3 hour epic, um, you got to have it absolutely dialed in. And when we get to that, I think that's why people really turn the screws on Cimino. with scathing reviews of that film because they were like, look, um, like you made this super long movie and I wasn't with it the entire way. And if you're not with it, man, that time drags. It really does.
Yeah, I think, the best comparison that I can think of now that can kind of it into perspective for us is if the new Avatar film had, the budget was definitely like hundreds of millions. Say it made like 10 million and it
Mm-hmm.
was a complete flop and like no one wanted to see it for whatever reason. James Cameron right now would be in a lot of trouble. It's that same kind of epic Titanic, Avatar type film. It just completely flopped. So much hype, and then for some reason people don't want to see it. The fact that James Cameron could get so many people to go see it, like the new 4 hour Avatar movie, is pretty crazy. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, I agree. Um, and coming off I mean, I guess there is something similar to be said. Uh, the fact that Avatar is a sequel makes it a little bit different just because people are familiar with the actual IP. But I think the same sentiment that audiences had faith in the director with James Cameron and Cimino during this time period was what gave people enough pause to just like, okay, we're gonna see this project through, even despite how close they got to pulling the plug on it. But what I find so uh, ironic, serendipitous, whatever word you want to use to describe it, is that there was a movie bomb, Cleopatra, which I think the entire production company, like, no one went into the office. And I think they said this in the documentary that we watched. They didn't go into the office for 4 months. So they had no payroll expense because that movie was essentially going to bankrupt them if it didn't turn around, which thankfully, I guess, it did. But that spurred the new Hollywood era. And then a almost similar situation where a huge budget just wasn't able to be covered in Deer Hunter was what ended this new era. So there is, I guess, some tragedy, poetic tragedy, perhaps, in the nature of how that era lived and died.
Yeah, it's something interesting, or an interesting thought I had when it was talking about Cleopatra in that documentary was how it briefly mentioned how they people went to see it still because of an off-screen relationship, I believe, between one of the actors and actresses. And it made me think about how now a lot of the times people can go see a movie just because, there's like a funny meme about it or something viral about the movie. Like my mind goes right to that Minions movie and how people were dressing up to go see it. Do you remember those?
Yes,
They were really funny, I think. People would dress up and go do like funny stuff for the movie, and that kind of thing, while it wasn't, like appropriate to do that in a theater, it was really good probably for the movie because it made more people interested in it, talking about it, and wanting to just go see what the whole thing was about. I think that can save a movie that's totally separated from the actual merits of the movie.
exactly. And there's another very recent example. Um, Morbius got put back in the theaters because of the popularity of the "It's Morbin Time" meme. It was a miscalculation because I think it like generated next to no revenue when they re-released it, but like that's the type of stuff that the producers are looking at and they're like, okay, it's time to capitalize, and it's very unpredictable to say the least.
Yeah, that's it's hard not to see that it's morbid time thing if you just like go on the internet for a good while there. So I can see why they at least tried, because that it's like the only like I bet most people don't even remember the actual film itself. They'll if they think about it, they'll just think of that meme or something about the more it's morbid time thing.
So the first film that we watched is The Deer Hunter. It covers a group of friends with whom three are, I think, enlisting. I don't believe they were being drafted, but to the Army Rangers to serve in the Vietnam War. Um, the kind of introduction we get to these characters is the wedding of one of the three, and Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken are the other two of this bunch that are going to go to Vietnam. And in Vietnam, they face the atrocities that, you know, really greatly depicts the suffering and the mental damage that happens to POWs during that time period. And the remainder of the movie is these three characters trying to integrate themselves into the world at large after having gone through this immensely traumatic experience. Matt, is there anything that you think is worth adding to that? And on top of that, what were some of the, I guess, impactful or powerful moments uh, for this movie to you?
Oh, well, I think that's a good description. The impactful moments for me uh started, when they got into Vietnam.
Mm.
Um, you know, I've seen other, movies with, like Platoon and that we've discussed, The Thin Red Line. And those movies, are really good at showing, you know, how war is for the people, who are living around the war, as well as, what it's like to actually be there, and kind of how it's not all maybe fun and games isn't the right word, but you see them kind of getting excited in the Deer Hunter to enlist and go fight. And then when they get there, they realize it's not, what they thought it would be. And that's, a common theme, but how this movie, what the impact it leaves for me comes from, you know, great performances help get this across. But, when they return and they're basically completely different characters. And, they're, I think my favorite part was De Niro's uh way of acting when he got back, how he was really paranoid, how he wasn't really living. It didn't feel like he was living in the same place as he was before. And his actions, I feel like, very closely resembled someone who would have, gone and fight and went through all of that and came back. So my favorite part was when he comes back and he refuses to go to the party
Mm.
because there. To me, I just felt a lot from that part. Like there's that says so much about how he feels about the whole situation.
Yes, certainly. I want to just kind of state how much I agree with you. There are some like really intense um, scenes while they are imprisoned in Vietnam, and those types of scenes always. I mean, it jumps off the screen. They're really really easy to remember. They're super impactful, but like you, I'm almost more impressed with what he was able to do in the subtleties of the character. like even when he was home, before he went, and then especially after he came back, because that is so important to the story to nail the landing on both of those. Robert De Niro does an amazing job. I mean, who's surprised? He's one of the best actors of all times. But had the comeback acting not been so strong, the movie would have really felt odd. So, he really drives the movie home. You said Thin Red Line. My mind went to, there is maybe some similarities to be made between a Terrence Malick and a Michael Cimino. And I kind of like the way that Malick did Thin Red Line, where he obviously that is a long movie as well about Vietnam, but I felt like the pacing was perhaps better in that film. But I mean, aside from length, and you know Malik a lot more than I do you think there's some other similarities to be made between Chimino and Malik?
Yeah, just thinking about it now, well, one difference, and then I'll talk about, how I think they are similar. But I feel like Malik is more focused on like filming something that feels, maybe you could say, holy or greater than reality, as he's trying to capture some kind of greater than human aspect of war and violence in a setting like Vietnam. Whereas here, I feel like he's bringing you into the reality of what there's no greater than kind of feel. It's, this is what's happening to these people, and this is what it's like for them when they get back. And that's reality, and how communities and groups of friends can change due to war. But in terms of the similarities, I think they both are going for, even though Malik is more, he kind of rises above to some spiritual level. They're both, I think, trying to capture the destruction, in general, the destruction that war brings. In the Thin Red Line, I think it's more about how it destroys maybe the way people act in battle or towards each other, and how bonds between people and humans are greater than just war itself, or that they can triumph over war. And I think here, um, it's kind of that same sort of broken feeling people get from war, but it's played out in them returning and being, shells of their former selves. So it's kind of that same, bond aspect between, people who are fighting or going through something traumatic. But I think that Cimino is focused more on the aftermath of war instead of that battle itself. Um, More like, uh, but they're both going for that sense of what, uh, how the violence in the war itself, you kind of question, is it really worth it? It seems kind of destructive and meaningless in both films when it's all said and done, because the aftermath, it's like no one truly wins from war, I guess you could say, is kind of the biggest theme between the two.
Yeah, it seems they're definitely very distinct perspectives of the loss of humanity while you're engaged in war.
Yeah, loss of humanity, I guess. It's just, shown in a different type of way.
What helps out the deer hunter a great deal, and we were discussing some of the aspects to this, but the like drinking before the wedding in the Deer Hunter. Um, I think that especially, and then a lot of the aspects of the wedding itself really help bring home what Cimino's trying to illustrate life like for these characters prior to going, halfway across the world. And they seem happy. They seem like, and they're even like excited to go to war, but they have this great community around them. They're able to enjoy themselves. They're able to celebrate, and all of that goes to hell after their time in Vietnam.
Yeah, and it's for both of them, maybe it's for the movies you could say that the slow cinema style kind of lets you get a sense of the characters more than through dialogue. One thing I noticed was at the beginning of Deer Hunter, for a lot of the first act, I was like, when am I going to get to start hearing these characters talk to each other? You just
Mm-hmm.
kind of I think he really likes to just show uh an event happening like the wedding, and then just really show it for a long time, and that lets you get immersed in the film and also kind of watch how each character acts. But there was also a point where I was like, can we move on from the wedding already? you know like I got you have to, I think, keep different things happening, um, that kind of take you to different places and question different things. Um, but I'm sure there's a lot of good things to say about that type of filmmaking too.
Yeah, I agree with both of the things that you just said, in that, yeah, certainly it's a lot of scenes like they stuck with for a very long time. The hunts, the whenever they went deer hunting, that seemed to go on for a fairly long time. Obviously, the wedding, and despite there being constant motion and constant things happening, it it kept speaking after its point was made, I suppose. And that, I guess you could see that as a criticism. For some people, potentially they really enjoyed feeling like they were in that scene. But but you might share my sentiment where you get the point across as to what he's trying to depict for these characters well before the scene ends.
Right, and that was like my pretty much my criticism of the film, like my, I guess, mid criticism, even though I still rate it really high. Um, Mostly because I really enjoyed the second and third act, but yeah, it was when I was watching the wedding, I was like, I kind of already realized, how these characters are. This is a group of guys that seem like they've been good friends for a while, and they're kind of rowdy and obnoxious, and they're really living life in the moment, enjoying themselves, and they think, Vietnam will be some sort of adventure. Um, and and then it just kind of keeps going, with that. And I just remember thinking, you could cut out like 20 minutes of this and I would still kind of get the same. So, that's not, the best thing to be thinking about while watching a movie, but it's still, you get to, I mean, the scene itself, I mean, the choreography and the time that went into that. I mean, it's great, like photography, and really great set and setting and scenery and all that. I mean, you could tell he's super meticulous with the details.
Mm, that's something that really came across in the Heaven's Gate documentary that we watched. He seems, and I guess, I mean, Fincher is only the maybe most recent example that I'm aware of, but I think Kubrick was very much the same way, where he could shoot a scene, upwards of like 50 times, I think they said during Heaven's Gate, um, which is insane when you think about a lot of the large scale scenes that he does shoot. Even in the Deer Hunter, I mean, a lot of the stuff going on within the wedding, you have to wonder how nitpicky was he with all the dancing going around, because that would be a nightmare if you're trying to get that picture perfect.
Yeah, and I have to think, that they talked about how he strived for authenticity in Heaven's Gate, but I got to think that he probably did the same in The Deer Hunter, with the Vietnamese especially. He probably wanted the Vietnamese actors and the whole culture and the way it was depicted to seem legitimate. And so I'm sure, kind of the one of the central points of the movie with the Russian roulette game was probably something they did in their culture and to the prisoners of war during Vietnam.
Absolutely. And I guess just before we get to that, because while they're in Vietnam, I mean, that is probably the most intense and like had me on the edge of my seat the entire time section of the movie. While the ending third is potentially the most compelling, but at the beginning, it definitely, as you were saying, through action over dialogue, gives you a really good sense for who the characters are. And I guess I'd like to kind of focus on the main three, because you do get that change after the war, or not, well, yeah, after the war ends. But what was kind of the sense of who Robert De Niro's character was, who Christopher Walken's character was, and I can't recall the name of the third soldier, but the character who got, you know, married at the beginning. What did you kind of feel from those characters, and what type of personalities did you have them pegged for before war?
Huh, interesting question. Well, it seemed like De Niro and Christopher Walken, they were fighting over the girl. They both seemed, kind of similar types of people. Whereas I believe the third guy's name in the movie was Steven.
Okay,
Um,
yes.
yeah, if I think I'm remembering that right, he seemed like the more, I guess you could say, nice or kind type of person out of the three. But they all just seemed like they had that we're like in our late 20s or early 30s, and we're just out to have a good time. They're a good group of friends that like to drink together, and they feel I guess a big part of it is they're patriotic for their country, which
Mm,
is the biggest shift, for after they come back. But uh, my one of my favorite parts of the film was how great their acting was and how they seemed, so happy and I guess just more satisfied with their life before they went.
mm,
All of them, especially Christopher Walken and Robert De Niro, more um, like they're the type of people that want to go out and take something or achieve something. They have a lot of motivation, and then you see that change.
yeah. I think like all of their arcs are really really interesting to me, and like De Niro's character is much more enigmatic in the beginning than Walken's. Like I feel like I can best describe Walken and Steven I slash Stevie. Do they call him Stevie, or am I just misremembering that? Either
I can't remember.
either way, like Stevie is or Steve, I'll just say Steven is kind of coming into his own. I think he grew up in a household where his mother was probably a very large figure within his life. I think he lived with his mother up until the point that he leaves for war, and then definitely afterwards, but he's becoming his own, because I think he can see in his future that this is a huge experience, and that he wants to become his own man as opposed to doing only what his mother wants him to do, like marrying that woman. And Walken's character seems like almost the moral compass, the smile of the group. He seems to light up the room. He's not afraid to express himself. But De Niro, he has like a quiet confidence to him, but he's also very reserved, especially during the wedding. He's okay with just standing on the sidelines, but he also does a lot of things to kind of prove his himself, or that he is like risk taking. Like the way he drives, he went streaking after the wedding, and but also that he's very independent and very like introspective, perhaps. I don't know if you got that. Like, how would you begin to describe De Niro? Because he's the one, like I said, he's he's got so many things going on.
Yeah, it's hard to like get a grasp on, I guess, his character as a whole because he's so different before and after.
Mm,
Like after, he gets back, he's, a complete. It's interesting because I guess one thing I noticed was before, they care about each other, and De Niro, they just seemed like his buddies. And after, it's like that became his whole life. And like I'm thinking of when he knows that I believe it's that Steve came back, or he when he finds out what happened to Christopher Walken's character, he immediately goes right back to look for him. It's like he is before he had more of a connection with, I guess you could say, his life overall, or
mm,
a sense of being in the community and being like a member of the community. Um, to when he gets back, it's like that stuff doesn't matter at all before. And I think the biggest contrast that I knew it was foreshadowing was when they're kind of teasing that vet, that they approach him with, you know,
mm.
being grateful and thanking him for his service. And then he just seems kind of out of whack to them. And, I had a feeling, okay, one of them's going to end up basically being this guy who looks like he's lost his mind. When they come back, they kind of all turn into a version of him.
Yeah, I agree. That sentiment, like that really struck a chord seeing him. Um, and I think that the group possibly was so oblivious to what was happening with that person that they weren't even like scared. Like, wait, like that's kind of intense. That like maybe something will happen over there that will affect us like that. They potentially, maybe they just thought that was this guy's personality, but after the fact, and us as viewers even during the viewing can tell it probably was the war that had its toll, and led it to his personality changing so greatly. One of the kind of important scenes, and it's a little bit related to that character, is when Christopher Walken is in the hospital, I believe in Saigon, but it's a medical hospital in Vietnam nonetheless. He's on the balcony, and it almost seems like, as he's talking to one of the higher ups who might also be a doctor, there was like a sense of him where because his physical injuries weren't so grave, but he was deeply, deeply mentally and emotionally damaged, that he couldn't like come to terms with the like I think he knew his you know service was up and that he was by no means able to serve his country anymore, but that he felt like almost cheated that he looked normal but he didn't feel normal.
Yeah, it, he to me was maybe it's hard to say the most affected because they were all, I feel like, affected equally. But in terms of like his, brain as a whole, right after he seemed like he was acting like someone who got a concussion or had a head injury. Um, like he couldn't remember quite who his family was. He did a little bit, but it was like he should know these things like off the bat, and he was having trouble like remembering them. And I know what you're talking about that, and the another part I believe of the same scene, can't quite recall, is when he sees the guy in the hospital who has like no limbs left,
Mm.
and he's thinking, that could have been me, but then I guess his injury was completely inside of him, you could say, like his basically his brain was injured, and he didn't quite he like it was the look on his face where you realize he didn't quite grasp what was going on, and I think that was a lot because his brain probably shut off what was going on. It was as if the whole ordeal with the Russian roulette kind of totally changed him, as a person completely. And I think this is something you see a lot with people that go to war.
Yeah, um, to the nth degree for sure, where they were super traumatized by what happened, and the depiction of that is super realistic, gritty, violent, visceral. It hits you deep in your soul. You can feel it in your stomach. So we're introduced to Vietnam. Robert De Niro is there as a village has been just totally destroyed. A Vietnamese soldier or a North Vietnamese soldier, I believe. It's was North Vietnamese, was that the communist side of Vietnam?
I couldn't tell you. I'm sorry.
No problem whatsoever. But the Viet Cong with which America was battling in the Vietnam War fought or shot a mother and his child. De Niro flamethrowers him, and a helicopter actually comes down with Steven's character and Christopher Walken's character, and then a bunch of mortar shells hit or some type of explosive, and we cut to they're kind of on this platform that is above the this river, and there's also these cages that are just barely above being submerged, and the Viet Cong are putting people in these cages to where you have to put your face up to the bamboo just to be able to breathe and not suffocate from drowning. And the people below them on this platform are surrounded by barbed wire, and they're bringing up soldiers two at a time to play this game of Russian roulette against each other. And there is, I don't know how to fully describe it, but there's something about that is deeply disturbing.
Yeah, I feel like what we were talking about the wedding earlier, how he kind of harps on the same sort of scene for a long time. I felt like it was completely justified in this sequence, the Russian roulette one, because it's terrifying. They're stuck down in that water and they're placed there and they're being used as uh, basically toys or entertainment for the Vietnamese people that had captured them. And, that whole, a lot of it is because, you never know if the gun's going to go off. It's part of why it's so intense. But a lot of it is the acting, especially with De Niro and Walker, or Walken, and how he's convincing him to just do it. And you can just sense he's getting more and more frustrated, like he's going to explode. And you could see, I was talking about De Niro there, and you could see, Christopher Walken is, it's like you can see his inner sense of life or his true self kind of fading away in that whole sequence. You kind of see him losing his mind there, which I think that was probably, I'd say, my favorite part of the movie. I don't know, not favorite in a good way, but just because of how memorable and intense it was.
Absolutely. Not to go off of like too far of a tangent, but and I think historically there's probably countless examples. One famous one that I've heard of is, I think it's Fyodor Dostoevsky. He wrote Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, some of the most famous novels or books rather of the 20th century. And I'm sure you are probably familiar with him, Matt, to some extent, whether just having heard of him or what have you. But one of his books was it was very criticized amongst the Soviet brass, and they did a false execution on him. And I'm not sure exactly if it was a fake firing squad or if it was just an unloaded pistol that they put to his head. But there is something deeply psychological to putting someone through the paces as though they're about to be shot and killed. And there's something that takes it even a step further when you're looking at someone across the table from you, realizing that I don't want them to die, but I don't want to die either. I hope to God this doesn't fire when it's in my hands, but do I want to see this person across from me die in front of my eyes?
Yeah, I mean, to me, there's something different. No, they're both terrible, but there's something different between just getting tortured and having to, like a forced suicide, but also
Mm.
you don't know if you're gonna die. There's just something about that feeling I think you would get where you're being forced to end your own life. Not only that, but you're playing a game against one of your best friends, uh, and so that if you lose, or if you win and don't die, they're more likely to lose and die. I mean, it's like all kinds of messed up, like, bundled into one. I just that sense of, being told that you're gonna, play this game and you might get killed and you don't have a choice here. It's I can't really think of anything much worse than that.
Yeah, I agree, and I think you put your finger on maybe the most impactful element to it, where I don't. There's so many innate feelings we have about suicide that even though it is forced, being the one who has to pull the trigger knowing full well it might be loaded adds a completely different spin to it that it would make it so I don't know how to put into words how powerful that is, but just even trying to begin to empathize with that situation, I can't imagine how sickening that would be to be in a scenario like that.
Yeah, to me, it's like an even worse form of gladiator battles where,
Mm-hmm.
it's usually fight to the death, but you're fighting for yourself, and you're thinking that, if I put my best effort into this, I can come out of it. Well, in this kind of battle, you're not really fighting anyone, and you're not really putting effort into it. It's just pure luck, pure roll of the dice, which is really terrifying.
How that scene impacts these characters, I don't know if this was something that even Cimino was trying to, like, something that these characters took away, or if it was just something that maybe I myself thought. But I think that De Niro and Walken's character coming out of that almost felt as though, and I think later on this movie is what kind of added to this sentiment that I have, that they were almost in control of it now. Like the fact that they have kind of overcome their own fate in these dire scenarios, that they were actually in control. Did you feel that way as well, or after saying that, does that hold any water for you?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, because there's several instances, like, I'm thinking of that one scene. And I can't recall for some reason if it was De Niro's character, or if it was Walken's character, but, that guy's teasing him, is his buddy teasing him with the gun, and he goes up, and remember, he, like, puts it to his head, and he just clicks it. Like, it's like they've overcome their fear of death, almost, is a good way I'd put it. But it's not, when someone overcomes a fear of death, mostly that's viewed as a good thing. Whereas in this case, it's scary. It's like they've played with their own life so much through this game that they're like over it. And part of you thinks, wow, maybe they just feel invincible now, as if, no matter what they do, they're not going to get killed from it. But I think it's worse than that. I think it's that they like don't care, or they're kind of so drawn to it, because I think the way, I'm not anywhere close to an expert on, like, PTSD or its effects, but I think the way I imagine PTSD to work is that it lives in your mind, and anything that resembles it just triggers that. So I think of people that have lived in prison for a long time, and you hear about, if they get released, a decade later and they come out, they're going to be really, really paranoid people. Someone's has their hands in their pockets around them. They're going to think threat, that's a possible threat, because they've lived for so long with that being a threat. And, like, utensils, they see someone using a fork, they're going to think, maybe I could get stabbed with that. It's just when you've lived in a traumatic type of living environment for, in this case, it didn't seem like they were there for that long, but it was long enough to leave an impact, to where anytime they see, pretty much anytime they see a gun anymore, it's going to bring them back to that moment, and it's like they can't get it out of their head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the scene you mentioned with the friend, just seeing the revolver was really triggering for Robert De Niro, and then he almost, felt it necessary to, like, okay, if this is the game you want to play, we're gonna play it, just to almost give him a taste of what he had been through. Like um, chastising him, but also showing him like you know don't play around with other people's lives. If you want to be a jagoff, then do it to yourself and see how it feels. But there's another really, I think, accurate depiction of just his everyday PTSD, which is when De Niro is visiting Steven at the VA hospital and a nurse drops pills on the floor and he snaps to attention to look at what the loud noise was, and you can almost sense and put the pieces together, certainly, that it brought him back and he had this very heightened sense of awareness and he was like in action when that happened, which is a pretty mundane event for people like you or I or anyone who has never seen war up close and personal.
Yeah, it's and from what I just seen and of people with PTSD, I think there's some sort of urge, and it's not that like they want it whatsoever, but it's like a urge to relive what you went through. And I think you see this with people that like assault kids. They oftentimes were assaulted themselves. It's and same with people who like physically abuse others or verbally. Oftentimes they were raised, not every time, but I'd say majority of the times they grew up in a scenario or a living environment where that happened to them often, and so it kind of becomes like a part of them that they can't get rid of. And when there's any type of occurrence that is in any way similar to it, in this case, a loud, even something as simple as a loud noise, or maybe even seeing a person that looks like someone they remember from over there, it's gonna kind of put their brain and body back into that moment, and they'll relive it and they'll start acting like they're there again. And I think it's a very interesting but horrible part of the human experience. And you just want it makes me think, before people realized or recognized that PTSD was a thing, I wonder what they thought, about these people. Like, is there something wrong with them? Like, and it doesn't have to do with war. It just brings up interesting questions about the whole a whole concept of all of it, of war and returning and how it affects you and your family and your friends.
I think the subject from an even broader perspective is so interesting, and you were going into it, and it made me think how negative experiences generally outlast more positive experiences. It's generally the traumatic experiences you've had in your life that really find the nooks and crannies of your minds to hide and come out when you least expect them. It's like those very traumatic, maybe days or weeks, are just overshadowing the enormity of their lives prior to going. But that is so true with human psychology. I mean, just one event can be something that impacts your life for the rest of your life. Honestly, unless you are able to seek help for it and overcome it that way. But that seems to be very very accurately depicted, and I think Cimino really did hit the nail on the head when kind of covering something that has been covered, certainly by others, but he might have been able to do it the best. And we've talked about Robert De Niro when he came back. He's really just so authentic. It feels real. But Steven's character said something that really stuck with me while he was in the VA hospital. And he says, "I don't fit." He said it over and over again as De Niro was trying to take him back home. I don't fit, as to say, I don't fit into society anymore. And I think that is a very common sentiment amongst all three of these friends that went to Vietnam. That what they've been through has changed them to where no one who hasn't been through something similar would understand.
Yeah, and it kind of reminded me of, that guy that they saw at the beginning. He just kind of said, fuck it, over and over. And it's kind of a way, I guess, that they are expressing themselves simply, and it's just kind of like they're done with, trying to live any sort of normal life. And it's like what they went through there is so much greater or of so much more importance or impact to them that it takes takes over completely. And Robert De Niro doesn't even really think of about the girl he was in love with. He is It's like his mind is only on the war and only on his buddies that he went there with, and he could care less about anything else. But it's not because he's uncaring. It's just because i- the events he went through is just cha- changed him completely to where his brain can't even really process that as being of any significance anymore. It's like that's the only thing he has left as the guys he went through it with, and the only thing he cares about is trying to connect with them because it's like that's the only people he can relate to anymore in a way, you know?
Exactly. Christopher Walken's arc is also potentially as interesting or more interesting than uh, than De Niro's, despite the fact that we get very little actual coverage of what he's doing. We only kind of you only kind of get the tale of what's going on, and that is that in Vietnam he stayed, he went AWOL, stayed back, didn't get actually, released and flown back home. And while he's there, he makes money hand over fist by competing in these Russian roulette games that I guess became popular out of the war, where two willing participants will engage in a game of Russian roulette. And I try to put my finger on the motivation for this, and I think coming in because I had an inkling of that major plot point, and I thought perhaps it stemmed from like a daredevil adrenaline junkie type of need to have that intensity that he had in war. But actually seeing the movie now, part of me feels like he was able to do some good by sending Steven any of the winnings, but that also he did not want to live with the trauma anymore. And maybe there's some nuances I'm missing there. Matt, how did you kind of interpret Christopher Walken's path or arc in the last third of this movie?
Yeah, I actually didn't that was something I didn't see coming, but it totally made sense with his character because I feel like to me he was actually my favorite or most interesting character to me. Maybe about even with De Niro, but I found him a little more interesting. He has this story of, as I mentioned earlier, you can kind of see he's not all there
Mm.
after um he gets, they get saved and brought back to the hospital or wherever he was, and he's listing off the names of his I believe it's like his parents or his relatives or people he knows, and he doesn't quite. It's like he doesn't understand that he's been saved yet. He kind of thinks he's still in danger, and then you see him. He talks to that guy who brings him into the match, and then he loses his mind and he's gone, or he freaks out there, and he shoots tries to shoot that guy and then leaves. And then after, it's like that was like another in my mind, that was another breaking point for him. It's like he got reintroduced to the trauma again, and it broke him. And so the next time you see Nero sees him towards the end, it's like he's barely clinging on to the person he was before. Like he's not really even, you get one little glimpse at it when he knows that line De Niro's character would say. I believe it was about like hunting or shooting deer, and you get that one last glimpse, but you realize that he's far gone. To me, he's some part of himself was completely lost to the Russian roulette event, to where it's like all he can do now is relive it. But then you get that little glimpse of his old self with De Niro, and you also get a glimpse of how he's somehow still there because he knows to send Steven money. You know.
That is an interesting point, and another kind of interesting detail that I overlooked some of the maybe like significance to it actually is that when Walken first goes to the, I guess, the Russian roulette club, I'll call it, that De Niro's character was in the audience watching, which is also like that's a really I don't know what drew him to be there either. I mean, do you think he was kind of and more importantly, is Walken seemed so disgusted with what they were doing. I wonder how he was able to be lured back into actually competing in it. Those are the things that they're really interesting, but I would like to kind of try to wrap my mind around. I mean, do you think De Niro would have maybe went down the same path had he not seen Walken there, because he was in the club? Do you think he was watching because he had been through something so devastating that he was completely desensitized and maybe I got entertainment out of it? Um, that and also what, like, how do you think Walken was able to be coaxed into doing this?
Yeah, that's an interesting part for me too, because when I saw him in there, I was like expecting more to come of it, like he was somehow a member or was super involved, but you don't really get an answer. And so, to my thought is that they are just drawn to it now because they went through it. Well, like you kind of said, that how traumatic memories or events leave a more lasting impact on your life oftentimes than the good ones. And I think that this is just the sort of thing where it's like they can't help themselves. It's when you go through something like that, I think you really like relive it in your own way, your own personal type of way. Like especially when it's something really negative, like I'll go back to the example of uh people who are in a domestic abusive relationship. People say, why don't they just leave? And I think a lot of the times it's because they're so trapped. It's like they're trapped, and they want it, but it's not. It's like your own mind is playing tricks on you, I guess is the way to say it. Like it's convinced you that this is a good thing, even though it's clearly objectively really a negative thing. And you keep going back for it. And it's like it's kind of an inexplicable kind of reason. Like there's no reasoning behind people wanting to stay in abusive relationships. Like objectively it's bad for, that for you as a party who's getting abused. But what brings them back is something it's that's super complicated and hard to answer. And I think it's that same thing that's bringing them back to the event. Like part of them wants to relive it, maybe because they think they can overcome it, or some part of them thinks if I just do this, I'll get over it, or if I'm there and I'm experiencing it, then it's not constantly living in my head, in the back of my mind. It's not constantly replaying because I'm there. So, those are just my thoughts. But I think it's something that is very, very hard to have a reasoning for, but it's something that you see all the time.
I completely agree. In that comparison to domestic relationships, I think that is probably a really great way to describe it. And perhaps Walken's character was dehumanized by that experience, which led to a delusion within himself that by playing Russian roulette was all that he was good for lack of a better term.
Yeah, it's like maybe it's just, that event is so important to him that nothing else even really matters anymore. Like that's all he has left to live for.
And that brings us to the climax of the movie, the potentially most intense and poignant and powerful moment where De Niro goes back and pays, I would have to imagine, a lot of the money he earned while in the Army Rangers, and maybe even some of the money that Walken sent to Steven. I'm not sure, but exorbitant sums of thousands of dollars just to get into a game to play against Walken with the intention of breaking through and being able to bring him back home. And it leads them to having to face off in a Russian roulette game, and they're having this conversation. One of the little nuances that I noticed is it seemed as though Walken was potentially using drugs. I don't know. There's I saw it was just a glimpse of his arm. There's a potential maybe it was cigarette burns, but I think more than likely it was heroin or intravenous drug use. Have you any? Do you think it was drug use, or do you remember that? I guess.
I do remember it, and that was for sure heroin use, just by the way his arm looked. He had been shooting up.
Yeah, I believe it's referred to as track marks, where he had obviously you can see the injection site and then kind of these deep, dark looking streaks up his arm. But wanted to clarify just because it was quick enough to where I didn't want to presume, but that certainly makes the most amount of sense. And it ends in the tragedy that De Niro is only really able to break through with which what you had mentioned earlier, them talking about hunting, and Walken says one shot, which was something that De Niro would speak of with hunting, that when you take down a deer, you want to be able to kill it with one shot. And it seemed like in that moment he was aware of his fate, that when he pulled the trigger it was going to fire, despite not having any true way to know that for certain. And perhaps that he really just wanted this devastating life to end.
Yeah, yeah, I got that sense too. I still wasn't sure if it would go off, but or who would end up, shooting themselves, him or Walken or De Niro or Walken. But yeah, you kind of get it's like that last glimpse of his former self, and then you're like, okay, he's probably about to go, and then it happens. It's sad because that story of getting addicted to drugs and uh trying to just reliving that war trauma in your head is so common for vets, and I think even more so for Vietnam vets.
I couldn't agree more. Matt, I want to ask you any additional thoughts for The Deer Hunter.
No additional thoughts. I thought, this was a great film, and I think this is one that anyone can get into, and I can see why it won Best Picture, and I think it was probably deservedly so. Wasn't sure who it was competing against or which movies it competed against, but I thought, this is a great movie. I could show anyone who says, "Hey, I want to watch something intense," and maybe they like war themes. Definitely show them this film.
Absolutely. Um, I'll give my rating first, and then Matt, I want to ask you yours. I I think I give this borderline like masterpiece status. Um, I give it a 4.5 out of 5. I think it's tremendous. It's not one of my all time favorites, but it's definitely one of my favorites and superbly done. How about you, Matt?
So I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. Um, I would say, like I mentioned earlier, a little. I like the Thunderbolt and Lightfoot a little more, but I agree. This is a masterpiece movie.
Absolutely. The next movie that we're going to be covering, I mean, we probably gave you a good appetizer as to a lot of the controversy or controversy for any of the English listeners. But this is a film about Jefferson County, Wyoming, I believe, in which a lot of people were stealing cattle, and a decision, a very controversial decision by modern day standards, was given from the presidency all the way down to make a kill list, as they refer to it in the film, to take out all of these criminals within Jefferson County. And our lead character or main character, played by I think Chris Christopherson, is the sheriff, in which takes it upon himself to try to help protect these people who are going to be murdered by the authorities at large. Matt, any additional plot points that you feel are worth mentioning?
I just want to say I think like the overall kind of theme is about focused on xenophobia in
Mm.
general, just being afraid of the other, whatever that might be. In this case, and oftentimes it's immigrants or people moving onto your land that you don't think belong there.
And I think that was a sentiment you could be much more open about, even at the highest level, being presidency, where I mean, Andrew Jackson is linked to a lot of atrocities, I believe, with the American Indians. You could kind of be a lot more open about racism, and racism came in all shapes and forms during this time period, not only against those of different skin colors, but also immigrants from different countries, which is, it's crazy to think about now, because a lot of people are proud of their Polish heritage, their Germanic heritage, whatever. But this is a really great depiction of, and you see it a lot more so in New York City, how the Irish were treated, how the Polish were treated, but it gives you the stakes, or I guess actually sets the stage a lot for how this was kind of across the board, um, that immigrants were very much looked down upon.
Yeah, I think it's a great and unique kind of story because, for example, The Searchers is a movie I would think is pretty similar, but that's more about, a classic, tale that Americans have heard about how horrible we were to the Native Americans. And we've also seen so many stories and movies about, how horrible we were to African Americans. And you don't, I haven't really seen a story that I can think of about the American West and just immigrants in general, even though at that time, this wasn't even the pilgrims who came over. I mean, they were new to the scene themselves. So it's interesting to see how quickly that whole uh, sense of entitlement to a property, I guess you could say, it develops among a group of people. Like they're there and they're like, we got here first. This is our land, and any sort of entrance from someone outside of the group is seen as negative. Even if they're themselves not bad people or they haven't done anything wrong, oftentimes they're going to make it out to be that way.
Definitely. This also is, it has a really kind of nice nuance or twist that Chris Christopherson, in the prologue, I guess, of this story of Jefferson County, comes from Yale in a time where there were dirt roads. So, I mean, he is, you could say, considered like kind of the upper echelon of class during this time period. And the people who are kind of would be uh, his cohorts, for lack of a better term, or the people that he would be surrounding himself with had he gone a different direction, boil it down to class and even use that as an insult against Christofferson and saying you're turning against your class by defending these criminals, these lowlifes, these immigrants who are stealing cattle. That was probably the most interesting spin to that character, for certain, and he felt that it was incumbent upon him to defend them because no one else of his status with his educational background would look after them if he did not.
Yeah, I really liked his character. I have to say the performances in the Deer Hunter were better. Like I got a more deeper extracted something deeper out of each character. But these character but I really liked he was a very likable character. Um he it's like he's kind of put in the immigrants are kind of the good guy camp, and there's really that divide of good and bad in this movie. But what I think it works because I think that's really just how it was. So I feel like it's realistic. Even though you don't really get to see a good side of the cattle company, they also they feel like it's their land, and so it's kind of it's an interesting dichotomy between the two groups that I, you don't see it in a lot of films. You don't you wouldn't. It would be weird to see, uh, for example, his character joining the Native American tribe and the Searchers or something like that. Like it could happen, but it's just not as doesn't feel as natural, and it feels like he in this film actually really does care for these people, and he realizes that this land doesn't belong to a cattle company. It should be more fair between the two. There shouldn't be, the American government shouldn't be coming in and saying this is how it has to be. But that that's how, America as a country developed in these times.
I agree. And Chris Christopherson's character, he is illustrated as someone who I think is like sick and tired of the maybe pretentiousness of those around him and the moral superiority that they feel, and seems to be more at home with the people of Jefferson County.
Yeah, that scene sticks out to me where he's asking the major if he had ever shot at someone himself. And then he just starts reeling off, like my brother's like the Secretary of State. And then you're just like, man, this guy sucks. um, so it's that sense of entitlement from Ivy League grads, but not even just Ivy League. It's like at this point in history, like you only went to college basically if you were going to an Ivy League school, and then you only went to college if you were like an old money type. Uh, Maybe you wouldn't call it old money and this long ago, but people who were politicians or related to important people or friends of important people, and so the class divide here is way bigger than it is now. And even though there's clearly class divides now where we have billionaires running so many things about or so many parts of American life, back then like they didn't just like run businesses that were big, they like controlled the way you're allowed to live. So it's definitely gotten better, and I think this movie shows how ridiculous the power people had that were in charge back then.
Yeah. And another very prominent and I thought impressive aspect, which you see, it's going to sound crazy to say in smaller doses because of everything we just described about the deer hunter, but you see in very large doses in Heaven's Gate is his ability to really depict realistic and violence. There, like I believe the movie starts and or transitions from Harvard to Jefferson County with Christopher Walken shooting through a like kind of a sheet to protect an animal that had been gutted. Starts off with a bang, and then there is a huge battle scene that is just impressive in scale and crazy violent, and then we have Walken's kind of cabin being just they're storming his cabin, for lack of a better term. All there was a lot of violence in this film, and I have to say I was really impressed by it. How about you, Matt?
Yeah, I was very impressed by it. It reminded me of the Peck and Paw Western we discussed a couple weeks ago in terms of how elaborate the scenes were. Uh, like in the Wild Bunch, the way they use the horses, especially, and I know this is probably meant there was some, you could say animal abuse on the set, but they were extremely elaborate scenes of people getting shot off horses. Uh, but one thing that stuck out to me the most, at least towards the beginning, was when they first entered the western town. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, wow, like this feel like it was hustle and bustle, like there was people everywhere, it was crowded. Uh, it all looked very authentic, and in my mind, I was like, this is probably the coolest western town set I've seen in any film. It looks real. It's not like I don't mind the deserted, uh, lonely western town we see in a lot of movies, especially the John Ford movies, where there's just not a lot of people there. It's kind of quiet, and then you got like the one guy who's kind of the one who's causing all the trouble. Here, it's like, wow, this feels like a real town and how it probably was in what would be considered a big city back in, 1800s in America.
Yeah, I have to agree with you. Um, that town looked absolutely stunning. It looked authentic. I mean, he was able to bring you to what that setting would likely be like, and that I feel is like a good transition to a lot of the decisions that Michael Cimino meant, both the horseback riding and the town itself, and in the lengths he was willing to go for authenticity. First off, I think they mention about 1,500 extras to be used to make the town and city feel like it was a living and breathing town with fully functioning buildings, and also Camp Cimino, where they would learn to ride on horseback. They would learn to rollerblade on actual, like, the rollerblades that were used during that time period, and all of that. And also, I think they did marksman shooting as well, which helped both of the most spectacular elements of this movie to really come through really well.
Yeah, and I believe he said, they wake up and they do those lessons. And I remember, if I might remember right, they also took some language lessons to help them, I think,
Mm-hmm.
sound more like, the immigrants at that time. And they pull it off. I couldn't tell even when they were kind of speaking English with the Germanic um, accent. They sounded pretty authentic, and it pays off in those big scenes, like the dance hall one where they're dancing with the roller skates on. Um, the one thing is I imagine, as a director, he seems really into this stuff, and I peg him as the type of person who thinks, wow, if I'm so interested in this, everyone else is going to be too. Everyone else is going to want to watch a, half hour scene of this, crazy dance because it's very well done and it looks really cool. But I think what he may have not gotten right is at the time I don't think audiences that he was his audience that he was targeting, being an Academy Award winner. Now he's like a star, he's got to appeal to the public. And I just don't I think he miscalculated how much people wanted to watch that. But I also think it's interesting how it's apparently the French critics thought this was one of the greatest American movies of all time. So you just get these very, differing opinions among the critics and the audience.
Yeah, exactly. One of the reviews that I messaged you about, because it was humorous. The cut I saw, I didn't feel that way, but also it was a different cut than I think what the critic was referring to. But he said it felt like a 4 hour forced house tour. Um, and I think that plays into like elements that you are speaking on, which is these things that he was had probably become deeply interested in. He wanted to show off in all its spectacle, um, when maybe a dose would have done you better. And I agree with your sentiment. I think, even though a ton of work went into that rollerblading scene, it probably would have been better had it been truncated. And also some of the other very big criticisms I saw. I'm sure you're familiar with the Razzies. If you're not, it's like the Oscars, but for what they consider to be like the worst movies of that year. Um, Chris Christopherson won a Razzie for worst leading actor. Cimino won for worst director, and David Mansfield's score got one for the most intrusive score. I think to varying degrees. I mean, I disagree with Cimino's direction being the worst. Christopherson, I thought, was good in his role as kind of a stoic Western hero. Although someone with a bit more magnetism and screen presence might have elevated this movie a bit more. The only one that I do kind of agree with is the score by no means is bad, but it does over the course of the 3 hour movie, it does get played a lot and maybe a lot more than it should have. Any thoughts on those criticisms? Do you agree or disagree with any of the criticisms?
Yeah, because his character, he's memorable, but I don't get too much of a deeper sense of like why he decided to stick with the immigrants, and it's like the movie makes you realize that it's the right side or the morally correct side, but I don't get much of a, and maybe I just missed it or maybe it's cut out, uh, but I didn't get much of a feeling for why is he so compelled to to act the way he is. Um, but yeah, no, or usually for me, I don't notice scores that much unless I think they're really good. And they can really draw me into a movie. And this, I mean, it didn't really happen here. But I guess the biggest criticism for me is, and this could, I have to say this is all subject to the potential edited version we watched because I believe we watched it was the theatrical version. It was like 3 hours. Um, and I just the story it felt like it went well and it was paced well, but besides the general conflict, I guess there wasn't too much I brought out of it. I want to say like that it felt a little predictable. I guess I could say like when that death list became a thing, when you realize that that's a thing, I thought in my mind, okay, this is going to lead up to a battle where they're gonna attack the immigrants at the end, and it's gonna all go out in a blaze of glory, and that's kind of what ends up happening. So I guess it's just kind of like the story is good, but I could see where it was going, which isn't exactly always a criticism, but I thought maybe a little, yeah, I would be brought in or intrigued by some other things that happened besides, what was going on in the standard plot.
Absolutely. Yeah. I I think on top of that, and this was something I was kind of discussing with you previously, was that there seemed to be some conflict between Christopherson, Walken, and Christopherson's, I guess, love interest. I think that love triangle was interesting, but it didn't feel fleshed out enough, and that is something that I think is it would rub audiences the wrong way, and it rubbed me the wrong way a little bit too because you are going so much into detail on these things that you're able to glean the importance of it fairly quickly, yet these actual aspects that could be illuminated much better felt more surface level than they ought to be for a movie of this runtime.
Yeah, yeah, like I didn't get a clear, reason why Christopher Walken and her were together, and he didn't. I mean, you see the conflict between them kind of fighting over her, and maybe I just missed it, but I felt like I didn't really know why it was resolved or if he still loved her afterwards. Because it seemed like he just kind of became okay with them being together, and that was kind of it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's just you're just supposed to, as an audience member, come to terms with it, you know, and you can kind of logically put the pieces together, but I think those interpersonal connections, there's a lot of meat on the bone to explore with that.
Yeah, they could have done a lot more with it. I did like how she was so participated in the battle so much at the end. I think that gave her character a lot more character, I guess you could say. Like you learned a lot about how she really cared and she was willing to go out and wanted to fight really bad to save, her people in their little town. She really cared and you get the same thing with the lead character. He cares about these people, but what was missing, I guess, is something that would help establish them on a deeper level of connection. Her and Chris Christopherson's character.
Yeah, she greatly embodies, like, you know a spirit that, with women characters or actresses, aren't generally portrayed in westerns. That she's entrepreneurial and very independent, and I guess her all of her interactions kind of help embolden that. By the way, and you may or may not know this, haven't seen the film, but I'm familiar with it enough and checked it myself just to be sure. She is the lead actress in The Piano Teacher by Michelle Haneke.
Oh, okay. I just connected those dots in my head. Wow. Yeah, she's really good in that movie. Dang.
Yeah, and she has a character that there is a lot of depth for. A very unique character, a strong character for sure. Um, I don't know. It truly is. It's hard to pinpoint all of the things that didn't necessarily land, but I will say there was a good amount that did land. I mean, like I said, the violence did. I thought Jeff Bridges was really great in every scene he was in. I thought Christopher Walken was really good as well. Christopherson was very solid. Um, I don't know. I
You know,
No, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, I think, coming out, I was thinking, it's like a conflicting opinions in my head. Part of me was like, wow, I really love this movie. This is a really good movie. But then, I also came away, and I know I messaged you this. I came away kind of feeling like I was missing something or I wanted more that wasn't there. And, that could have one thing been from how much it was cut down in the editing, considering the original link was like 5.5 hours. But also, I think it's there. I didn't care about the characters as much as the Deer Hunter,
Mm,
but I think the reason why I liked the movie was I think what it said about the American West and uh, America's early days was one of the best movies I had seen about it. We've seen a lot of westerns and they're great movies, but I don't think they depict how the Americans of the time, or how we often see and study, the great American heroes of the founding of our country. We don't really see the bad side of them a lot, and I think this showed how they were pretty hegemonic and dominant, and the anti-immigrant thing started pretty early. And you see it still nowadays, what immigrants are coming over and there'll be stories about, they'll pick and choose people who are really bad people and they come over and they do commit horrible crimes. And then that leads people to logically somehow, it's illogical, but they conclude, okay, then we just can't, then they're all bad people, because there's a few bad people, they're all bad. And I think that sentiment and viewpoint is always been around, and I think it always will exist. I don't think it's something you can get rid of. And I just think this movie kind of makes me question, well, was, the establishment of, the colonies in America really so, bright and happy as they make it out to be in textbooks? Well, no, there was a lot of bad actors and bad things that went along with it. And this is an example of one of those. And I just think that that really, when I get a theme about history, because I love history, when there's like an overarching theme of a movie about a historical event and it captures a truth that you often don't hear about, but is still realistic, that's something I really personally enjoy about a film. So
I
that was kind of like my overarching praise for it.
I completely agree. In the documentary, they go through the elevator pitch as to what this movie was going to be about. It was after I had watched the movie, and I was like, yeah, I would have greenlit a project like this too. Like the premise of this town, being at odds with insurmountable odds, being essentially the U.S. government. That's damn compelling, and I think you're right. Where that it loses touch is that you're not emotionally attached to the characters enough to where you feel the emotional weight of their battle, where you don't want to see them in harm's way at all. And you made another good point that I think I would have to completely agree with, in that no disrespect to the editor who aided Cimino whatsoever, because I mean, I think they had said he set the record for the amount of film shot. That would be, I can't imagine the impossibility of taking thousands of feet of film and trying to put that together to form the most compelling narrative ever. Because there's probably 100 narratives that you feel like are all really great that you could go with. It's it's the what do they call it? Like the paradox of choices, where I think it's like after 3 to 5 choices, it becomes like almost impossible to actually choose something because you have too many choices, and you are always second guessing if you're making the right one after a certain point. But I also feel like Cimino possibly, and this is going to go very contrary to a lot of sentiments that I've had towards directors being able to put out their own vision and have artistic or creative control. He might not have been the guy who should have been at the helm making editing decisions. At least from my perspective.
Yeah, I think, when you just won 5 Academy Awards, I think he, is on that pedestal of I can do nothing wrong and I'm gonna go for it and make my dream movie because I can, because everyone's trusting me right now. And then I think it's just one of those cases where he just got in over his head. Um, I mean, another interesting part about the editing and cuts that's kind of a fact about this movie that you don't really see for almost any other film is the amount of different versions that are available because of how long the original was. I mean, you got like 4 or 5 different cuts. I read about how Steven Soderbergh, oh, I can never say his last name. but I'm sure you know who I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, right? You know who I'm
Soderbergh.
Soderbergh, yeah. So he even made like an hour 48 cut of the movie himself. So there's like four or five different versions of it out there, and I think they probably are all very different. I was thinking a lot about how if there really was an hour 45 minutes more to this film, I might have lost interest early on. So it's just a very kind of strange conundrum for a movie you don't see a lot of the times. You usually see like maybe two cuts, maybe like one and then a director's that's a little longer. You don't see like four or five.
Exactly. You know, bringing it back to modern times, we had the release the Snyder Cut whole groundswell that
Yeah.
happened. This seems like the contrary to that, where it was the director's vision that was kind of pushed by the wayside and forced him to almost admit defeat in and try to release something that would be more consumer friendly with the cut they came out with after the original theatrical cut.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Zack Snyder. I never actually thought about that, but he's kind of similar in a lot of ways to Cimino. I think that, he had a really, epic vision on what the Justice League or what DC comics heroes could be. And I think he got a little too ahead of himself with that too. And you create this, situation now where you have some people who think he's an absolute, master of his craft and he can do almost nothing wrong in his films. And then you have the people that think, this is way too long and like why are you why are you doing this much? I think he's a guy that loves his own work kind of similar to the way Chimino does.
Yeah, I I think you're dead right, and part of me, this is you know, maybe inconsistent when considering the fact that Chimino did make concessions as far as releasing an additional cut. I think that was almost a way where it's like, okay, I want to save myself so that I can make projects that I want to in the future. But I would have to believe maybe once a few years, maybe even a decade plus after the fact, he may very likely look back on this movie with a sense of pride that he was glad he was able to make something that he aimed to have as his magnum opus, despite all of the negative press and the whirlwind that surrounded him and this movie after the fact. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, I think he for sure was confident in what he made. From that documentary, it sounded like he was constantly fighting with the producers, but the producers were just trying to, bring him down to a more sensible level. But he was at that point where, artists get to a state of mind where they have so much freedom to create and all this money. He's just going to go crazy with it. And the type of detail oriented person he was seems like he was completely obsessed, completely addicted to making this movie as perfect as he could. And I think he just probably feels like people didn't get his vision on this one. And it really was greater than people thought. But I mean, when you're, what did they say? It made 1 million or 3 million, and he cost 40 million to make it. And I mean,
Mm-hmm.
that is quite a loss. I've never really heard of another movie that lost that much money, and it destroyed that United Artists studio, which is created by like Charlie Chaplin and D.W. Griffith, like some of the first people to make movies. It's truly a sad scenario, and it's I wonder how he felt about the whole thing.
Yeah. I wish, because I know the documentary, I think it ends with that they'd asked Cimino to come in to, be interviewed as well, and he declined. But that is a perspective I would have loved to had gotten. And on top of that, I think we're we're living in the timeline in which this movie brought about, where only proven commodities are going to get greenlit for such exorbitant budgets. If to where blockbusters are very much formulaic in that it's going to be a reboot, it's going to be a sequel, or it's going to be a part of a cinematic universe before they make that large of an investment. And I can't speak too greatly on the 80s cinematic decade, but from what I've heard from interviews from the likes of a Quentin Tarantino and a lot of other people who love cinema, it seems like the 80s were kind of a depression as far as movies go. It's definitely not one of those decades looked upon super fondly through 2020 vision of where we sit now in regards to the 80s. But I would have to think there is a role in that because directors weren't going to be given nearly as much control as they had previously, and that another take from Tarantino where directors weren't willing to go against production companies to have their unique visions brought to screen. But I feel like production companies were probably cracking down a lot harder after this monumental failure, at least financially.
Yeah, when you get, when you lose that much money and everyone watches that play out, and that basically that whole story became bigger than the movie itself. And I think lodged a lot of criticism onto the film that was probably not deserving just because, people are thinking, "Oh, he's wasting all this money, making this movie," and that makes people want to care about it even less. And then when it becomes news about that instead of about the film, then everyone in the business world is just going to be completely reluctant, at least initially. It's kind of like when you see a stock just drop significantly. It's like no one is basically the stock is dropping because no one is putting their trust into it anymore. That's kind of I'd say what this caused was like uh no one in the business world would put their stock or put their money into the stock of a new producer, or I'm sorry, a new director making a film because you just saw this horrible thing occur. It's like you see a attack on your, you're gonna up security a bunch right then because you just saw it happen. It's that same reactive effect here.
Exactly. And because of the time period, I don't know whether this calculation would be nearly as accurate, but like when looking at budgets, especially of modern movies, to come to at least come close to the actual final numbers spent because of all the advertising that you do to actually get people to go, it's generally the budget times 2.5. And like actually I've done it with a decent amount of movies within the last like 5 to 7 years, and was able to come really damn close to the actual net profit that movies get. So you take the 40 million, I think it's a little over, it might be closer to 44 million. You're getting close to $100 million spent, and like I guess the gracious number between the two. I'm not sure if, like you said, it's one or three, but I mean, it doesn't matter at that point. Even if it made 10x 3 million, if it would have made 30 million, that's still a monumental loss. It's just that's gonna completely change people's perspectives, and it's gonna be like a ghost story for other producers to keep in mind, that it's like, hey, I don't want that to happen to us. We better lock down the hatches and buckle our seatbelts and be on the lookout, be vigilant, and not let anything like that, come close to happening here.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, oh, the just constant battle it looked like during production. People getting fired. I believe they had different producers switched out a couple different times. Uh, and Cimino being extremely adverse to anyone coming in and checking him. I mean, it just seemed like a disaster. I mean, when you have that elaborate of a place to where it's basically like a summer camp, and it's also probably not being run the best ways. 'Cause I believe the documentary mentioned how it was so many of their first people's first times on a movie set. I mean, it had got to have been chaos, and I think that chaos attracted the attention of people more than the film. Like it, just think another huge budget film. If news came out that another Avengers movie was coming out, and uh, like something just terrible things were happening on the set, or people were fighting and quitting, that would become the news story instead of the movie. It's just one of those things where it kind of takes over and overshadows the film.
Yeah, I guess a relatively modern example. It's in a different vein, but I think is it's very applicable because it affected the reception of the movie. Is from the Solo movie, the Han Solo movie, Star Wars, in which the lead actor, I don't know if you recall this, Matt, but the lead actor was, I think they requested that he take acting lessons during the filming of the movie, and a lot of people were like, this guy is, if he's getting acting lessons now, he's going to absolutely suck. And I have not seen the film. I don't know how well his acting actually was, but I am pretty aware, if memory serves correctly, according to, I think, Deadspin and even the calculations I did on my own, I think it lost money, which is that's an absurdity to think of a Star Wars movie losing money.
Yeah, that's a doesn't usually happen. Another film I was thinking of, I cannot remember the name of it, but it was the murder mystery movie that came out last year, and
Glass Onion.
no, 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 it wasn't Glass Onion. It was the it had a bunch of lead actors, and people were saying it was
Ah,
Oscar bait.
Amsterdam.
Yes, that film, all those stories came out all of a sudden about how the director was like creepy with like his underage niece, and was also really treated actors and actresses on his sets poorly. And like there was a video that I saw of him was like screaming at this actress, and a bunch of people saying they never wanted to work with him. And that basically became the story of the film. I didn't really even know what the movie was about at all.
Yeah, I agree. That was overwhelmingly, just looking at reviews on Letterboxd, that was like half of everyone's reviews, and I watched the film just out of curiosity to see, is this truly bad, or is it just getting wrapped up? And the film was, it was disappointing, because of all the great actors in it. But a lot of people aren't even get, and I didn't go to see that in theaters, despite when I saw the trailer and all the talent that was involved, I said to my girlfriend, I'm like, we have to go see that film. And then all the negative reviews came out, and a lot of that was possibly spurred uh, by that. But and then I was like, oh, well, it turns out this movie isn't good. I had to wait for it to come on to HBO Max before I was willing to give it a chance. And I think that can be said for Heaven's Gate. I prefer Heaven's Gate to Amsterdam, without a doubt. Not a perfect movie either, but it is insane how the narrative can oftentimes replace the reality, I guess, of a movie's actual entertainment value.
Yeah, yeah.
So, Matt, I want to ask you: is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I mean, I think this movie is still worth a watch. Maybe I and seeing it, I'm not going to do this anytime soon, but seeing the version I saw made me want to see the full thing. I didn't really have time to spend the 4 hours on it or try and find the 4 hour version, but I didn't think it was as bad as people made it out to be. I thought it was a pretty good film, and there was a lot of things I liked about it. So I still think it is worth the watch, but I would watch The Deer Hunter first.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're probably both in agreement where if you have to recommend a Cimino film, Thunderbolt and Lightfoot and The Deer Hunter are going to be much more accessible to the majority of people. But also agreeing with what you said, this is a worthwhile movie. I don't. I think the positives, at least from my perspective, outweigh the negatives. It's not a masterpiece, at least the version we watched, in my mind, but it's really good. I think.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, Matt. What's your rating on this film?
Yeah, so the rating was the thing I had the hardest time coming up with. I initially rated 3.5, and I changed it to 4, and then back to 3.5. So for me, this is a very hard film to rate just because of all the different versions there are of it. So I'm gonna leave it at 3.5 and say that I believe the full length version would either bring it up to a 4 or take it down to a 3, depending on what was actually included in it.
Yeah, I'm at a 3.5 as well. And I would like, if you came to me and said I watched the other cut and it's amazing, it's the best thing I've ever seen, that would probably draw me to make the time investment to watch it. But to harken back to a point you made previously that I full heartedly agree with, the issues that were in this cut, I don't know if they could be fixed by a different cut. I truly agree with that because I don't know how you could patch up some of the issues that persist in this film.
Yeah, yeah, that I think so too. I think maybe some of the stuff I wanted to be flushed out a little more would have been, but I also think back to the Deer Hunter and think, he might have just spent way more time on things I didn't care about. So who knows?
Yeah, and I guess to end this episode, what do you think is the happy medium? Because we've talked at great lengths as to how giving the artistic freedom to the director can create some of the masterpieces in cinema that stand the test of time, that can be watched now and are still just downright breathtaking, amazing films. What's the happy medium? Because I mean that I don't know. It's hard for me to say that production taking back control is a good thing because ultimately I don't see this as a bad film. I guess financially it's not sustainable, but what is the happy medium, I guess?
Yeah, that's hard. I think my stance would be, and you know, you could say this applied to Cimino as well because he had two successful films. But I'd say, you know, give the director creative freedom, but maybe don't give him this much uh money
Mm,
until he's further established himself, you know? Like like someone like Scorsese who, you know, at by the 80s and 90s he had made tons of just really successful and popular movies. I think you give someone like him a budget like this and you're more likely to get something profitable. And I also think that uh, if a director, and oftentimes it doesn't happen these days because they're kind of directors for hire, and so they, you know, they'll pick, hey, you did a good job on this franchise movie, come make this one. But I think that if you give someone who's known more as a director, you know, like Scorsese again, give them a budget like this and have them make an epic if they want to, and let them have creative control over it. I still think that's I really like those styles of movies more, and this is also just probably coming from a personal and perspective of someone who doesn't care as much about how well a movie does. I just want it to be good.
mm.
Um, I would say, you know, let them have the creative control, but you know, from a business standpoint, it's almost the opposite. I say only give them the money if you know for sure that they are a reliable person and can almost guaranteed make that money back for you. So it's just kind of all about the perspective you take, you know.
Yeah, and I want to just kind of drop in an interesting point. Robert Eggers, the director of the Witch, director of The Lighthouse, and most recently director of The Northman, made money on his directorial debut, um, and I think even the official numbers agree that The Lighthouse, surprisingly, because you think that would be a relatively lower budget film, actually lost about $1 million, but was greenlit for what's considered a bigger budget movie with The Northman. I think it was a $60 million budget. And they really ate their own hats on that movie, despite, in my opinion, it being one of the best movies of 2022. So there's some real push and pull with that where, you know, his artistic vision did come about. I thought it came off really, really well, and damn, I'm glad he made that movie. But I mean, it's probably just going to be another thing where producers are like, okay, well, we can't trust Eggers with a budget above X number anymore until he proves himself. It's really interesting, and I guess, but had they done that previously, I mean, I wouldn't have got to see maybe one of the best Viking epics in cinematic history. Nonetheless, it is a really interesting push and pull, and I think really the only involvement that I would think is worth making is budgetarily, and then aside from that, give the creative control to the creative people.
Yeah, and you know, you also got to try and figure out maybe more as a producer than a director what to fund based on what you think general audiences are going to want to go watch. You know, like maybe uh, somehow the lighthouse story, that kind of scary story, drew more people in than a Viking story. And you know, maybe people weren't as interested in a western about, you know, start of America in 1980. Yeah. Also, you have to take, you know, it's what people want, what the audience wants.
Absolutely. that's all I have, Matt. Do you want to end with any closing thoughts?
No, I mean, I think I said just about everything I had to say about this film. So,
Well, that's all from us on Michael Cimino and the life and death of the new Hollywood era. I hope you all enjoyed. If you did, like and subscribe. And we will catch you on the flippity flip. Bye, y'all.